Harrison laughed loudly at his estate. "I'll give you my entire inheritance if you can prove you're worth more than dirt." Eleanor, the elderly housekeeper, trembled as she held the keys. What came out of her mouth next froze the smile on his face forever. The luxury sedan's engine still hummed in the circular driveway when Vincent Caldwell burst through the mahogany doors of his Westchester estate, his Italian leather briefcase forgotten on the marble foyer. 3 weeks of international negotiations had drained him, but nothing could have prepared him for the sound that pierced through the afternoon silence. A weak, desperate knocking coming from somewhere deep within his own home. His heart hammered against his ribs as he followed the rhythmic tapping, each step echoing through hallways that suddenly felt foreign and threatening. "Please, someone help me," came a frail voice from behind the locked door of what used to be a guest bedroom. The voice belonged to Theodore Caldwell, his 78-year-old father, but it carried a desperation that Vincent had never heard before. The brass doorknob rattled uselessly in his grip, locked from the outside. Vincent's hands trembled as he searched frantically for the key, his mind racing through impossible explanations for why his father would be trapped in a room that reeked of stale air and human suffering. When the door finally swung open, Vincent's successful businessman facade crumbled completely. Theodore sat on the edge of a bare mattress, his usually pristine appearance replaced by wrinkled pajamas that hadn't been changed in days. Dark bruises painted his forearms like twisted watercolors, and his silver hair was matted with sweat from the suffocating heat that had been deliberately trapped in the airless room. The window was sealed shut, the air conditioning vent covered with duct tape, transforming the space into a prison cell disguised as a bedroom. "Vincent, my boy," Theodore whispered, his voice cracking with relief and shame. "She said you'd never come back for me. She said I was nothing but a burden now." The words hit Vincent like physical blows, each syllable revealing layers of psychological torture that had been systematically inflicted while he pursued million-dollar deals across 3 continents. His father's eyes, once sharp and commanding, now held the hollow look of someone whose spirit had been methodically broken by calculated cruelty. Eleanor Hartwell appeared in the doorway like a shadow given form, her practiced expression of concern sliding across her features with theatrical precision. "Oh, Mr. Caldwell," she said with rehearsed surprise. "Your father has been having such difficult episodes lately. The doctor said isolation was best when he gets confused." Her words dripped with false compassion, but Vincent caught the flash of cold calculation in her eyes, the look of someone whose carefully constructed lies were beginning to unravel. In that moment, he realized that the woman he'd trusted to care for his most precious family member had become the very monster he'd unknowingly invited into their lives. 6 months earlier, Vincent Caldwell had been drowning in a different kind of darkness. His wife Catherine's departure from this world had left him hollow, a successful shell of a man who could negotiate billion-dollar mergers but couldn't figure out how to make breakfast without her gentle guidance. The sprawling estate that once echoed with her laughter had become a mausoleum of memories, each room holding ghosts of conversations that would never continue. Theodore had moved in after Catherine's funeral, but Vincent's grief had made him a stranger to his own father, barely present even when they shared the same roof. Eleanor Hartwell had arrived like an answer to prayers Vincent was too broken to speak aloud. The employment agency praised her 20 years of experience with elderly care, her impeccable references, and her almost mystical ability to bring comfort to grieving families. She presented herself as a widow who understood loss, someone who could provide the compassionate care that Vincent felt incapable of offering, while his heart remained shattered into pieces. Her gray hair was always perfectly arranged, her clothing modest but dignified, and she spoke with the kind of gentle authority that made even strong men feel like protected children. During their first meeting, Eleanor had taken Theodore's weathered hands in hers and spoken to him with such apparent tenderness that Vincent felt his chest tighten with gratitude. "Your son works so hard to honor your dear Catherine's memory," she had told Theodore, her voice soft as silk, "and I'm here to make sure you're surrounded by the love and care you deserve while he heals." Theodore had smiled for the first time since the funeral, and Vincent had felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he didn't even realize he'd been carrying. The deception had been masterful in its simplicity. Eleanor understood that grieving people needed to believe in goodness, that they would willingly hand over their most precious responsibilities to anyone who promised to shoulder the burden with grace. She had studied Vincent during those first weeks, cataloging his patterns, his absences, his desperate need to escape into work where emotions could be replaced by spreadsheets and conference calls. She watched as he gradually increased his business travel, telling himself that he was securing his family's financial future when he was really just running from the empty spaces that Catherine used to fill. By the time Vincent realized he'd been gone more than he'd been home, Eleanor had already woven herself into the fabric of their daily lives. She answered the phone, managed Theodore's medications, and provided Vincent with carefully crafted reports about his father's well-being. Every conversation was designed to reassure without revealing, to satisfy without illuminating, creating a false sense of security that allowed Vincent to disappear into his work while darkness took root in his own home. The signs had been there like breadcrumbs scattered along a path Vincent had been too distracted to follow. Mrs. Patterson from next door had called twice while he was in Singapore, leaving messages about strange sounds coming from the house at odd hours, crying that seemed to go on for too long, doors slamming in the middle of the night, and an unsettling silence during what should have been normal daily activities. Vincent had dismissed her concerns as the overactive imagination of a lonely widow, but now her words echoed in his mind like accusations he should have heeded. Theodore's appearance during their brief video calls had gradually deteriorated in ways that Eleanor expertly explained away. The fresh bruise on his cheek became a fall in the bathroom, handled with professional care and doctor's visits that somehow never required Vincent's presence. His father's increasing reluctance to speak during their conversations was attributed to medication adjustments and natural aging, delivered with Eleanor's concerned but reassuring tone that made Vincent feel grateful rather than suspicious about the growing distance. The financial irregularities should have been impossible to miss, but grief had made Vincent sloppy with details that would normally trigger his businessman's instincts. Eleanor had slowly increased her requests for household expenses, special medical supplies, therapeutic equipment, organic foods that Theodore supposedly needed for his declining health. Each invoice was presented with such detailed medical justification that Vincent approved payments without question, telling himself that no cost was too high for his father's well-being, while his own emotional well-being crumbled. Most telling of all were the changes in Theodore himself during Vincent's brief visits home. The vibrant man who had built his own successful construction company from nothing had become subdued and anxious, jumping at sudden sounds and watching Eleanor with the wariness of someone living under constant surveillance. He spoke in whispers when she wasn't in the room and fell silent entirely when her footsteps approached, his eyes carrying a fear that Vincent attributed to age-related confusion rather than the systematic psychological warfare being waged against him daily. Eleanor's performance had been flawless, alternating between concerned caregiver and protective guardian with the skill of someone who understood exactly how to manipulate both family dynamics and human psychology. She positioned herself as the only barrier between Theodore and the chaos of institutional care, making Vincent feel not just grateful, but dependent on her presence. Every conversation included subtle reminders of how difficult elderly care could be, how lucky they were to have found someone so dedicated, and how devastating it would be for Theodore if his routine was disrupted by change. She had made herself indispensable while systematically destroying the man she was supposed to protect. The transformation in Eleanor's demeanor, once she realized her deception was exposed, was like watching a master actor drop their most convincing role. The gentle, caregiving saint evaporated, replaced by a woman whose eyes held the cold intelligence of a predator who had been cornered but wasn't yet ready to surrender. Her hands, which had just moments before been arranged in a posture of false concern, now clenched into fists that revealed the true strength she'd been hiding beneath her performance of frail servitude. Vincent helped his father to his feet, feeling the alarming lightness in Theodore's frame that spoke of meals skipped and medications manipulated to keep him weak and compliant. As they made their way toward the main living area, Eleanor followed with the measured steps of someone calculating their next move, her mind clearly racing through explanations and excuses that might yet salvage her position. The house that Vincent had known all his life suddenly felt like enemy territory, every shadow potentially hiding evidence of cruelties that had flourished in his absence. Theodore's fingers gripped Vincent's arm with desperate strength as they settled onto the leather sofa that had once been Catherine's favorite reading spot. "She keeps me locked away when anyone comes to visit," Theodore whispered, his voice gaining strength with each word of truth he was finally allowed to speak. "She tells people I'm sleeping or having a bad day, but really she just doesn't want anyone to see what she's done to me." The words tumbled out like water through a broken dam, months of suppressed testimony finally finding voice. Eleanor positioned herself near the kitchen doorway, her posture suggesting helpful retreat, while her eyes calculated distances to exits and important documents. "Mr. Caldwell has been experiencing some confusion lately," she interjected with practiced authority, her voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to being believed without question. These episodes can be very realistic to him, but they're really just manifestations of his declining mental state. The doctor has been very concerned about these delusions. Her words were delivered with such clinical precision that for a moment, Vincent felt the familiar tug of doubt that had kept him blind for so long. But Theodore's bruises told a story that no medical explanation could justify, and Vincent found himself studying Eleanor's face with the analytical skills that had made him successful in boardrooms around the world. The micro-expressions that flickered across her features, calculation, irritation, contempt, revealed the true person beneath the carefully constructed mask. This woman had been systematically torturing his father while accepting payment for compassionate care, and her only concern now was maintaining the lies that had protected her for months. The time for believing in her performance was over. Catherine's personal study had remained untouched since her departure, a shrine to her methodical nature and keen intuition that Vincent had always both admired and relied upon. As Eleanor busied herself in the kitchen, no doubt planning her next strategy, Vincent found himself drawn to the antique writing desk, where his wife had spent countless hours managing household affairs and maintaining the extensive correspondence that had been her joy. The locked drawer that he'd been unable to face opening suddenly seemed to pulse with urgency, as if Catherine herself was guiding him toward answers he desperately needed. The small brass key hung exactly where she'd always kept it, hidden beneath a loose corner of desk blotter paper that she'd shown him years ago with a conspiratorial smile. Inside the drawer, beneath old photographs and birthday cards, Vincent discovered a leather-bound journal and a sealed envelope marked with his name in Catherine's distinctive handwriting. His hands trembled as he opened the letter, dated just 2 weeks before her final hospital stay, when she'd still been lucid enough to recognize patterns that others might miss. "My dearest Vincent," the letter began, "I pray you never need to read this, but I have concerns about Eleanor that I cannot ignore. She asks too many questions about our finances, our insurance policies, and Theodore's medical needs. More troubling is how she speaks to your father when she thinks I'm not listening. There's a cruelness in her voice that doesn't match her public performance. I've hidden copies of our financial records in the basement safe behind my grandmother's portrait. The combination is our anniversary date. Trust your instincts, my love, and remember that people who truly care don't need to constantly remind you of their devotion." The journal revealed months of careful observations that Catherine had been too ill to share but too concerned to ignore. Detailed entries described Eleanor's manipulation tactics, her attempts to isolate Theodore from visitors, and her systematic efforts to gain access to important family documents. Catherine had even documented strange phone calls where Eleanor discussed money and inheritance with someone she referred to as her partner, conversations that painted a picture of premeditated exploitation rather than genuine caregiving. Vincent pressed the journal against his chest, feeling Catherine's protective love reaching across the months since her departure to shield the family she could no longer physically protect. Her insights provided the framework for understanding everything he'd witnessed, but failed to interpret correctly. The fear in his father's eyes, the financial discrepancies, the isolation that had been systematically imposed under the guise of medical necessity. Armed with his wife's wisdom and his father's testimony, Vincent finally had the tools to dismantle Eleanor's web of deception and reclaim control of his family's safety and dignity. The basement safe revealed a treasure trove of evidence that Catherine had methodically gathered during her final months, each document carefully organized and annotated in her precise handwriting. Bank statements showed a pattern of unauthorized withdrawals disguised as medical expenses, with amounts that had steadily increased as Eleanor grew bolder in her theft. Forged signatures on insurance forms and falsified medical reports painted a picture of systematic fraud that extended far beyond simple embezzlement into the realm of identity theft and insurance fraud. Most damning of all was a collection of recorded phone conversations that Catherine had secretly captured using an old tape recorder hidden in the kitchen. Eleanor's voice, stripped of its performative gentleness, revealed the true scope of her operation as she coordinated with accomplices to maximize the financial exploitation of the Caldwell family. She discussed Theodore's medication schedule with cold calculation, explaining how certain combinations could increase confusion and compliance, while avoiding detection by casual medical examinations. The recordings also exposed Eleanor's long-term plan to establish legal guardianship over Theodore, a process she'd been carefully orchestrating through a corrupt attorney who specialized in exploiting elderly clients. Her conversations revealed detailed knowledge of inheritance laws and strategies for isolating family members from their vulnerable relatives, suggesting that the Caldwells were not her first victims but rather the latest in a series of carefully targeted families who had been systematically robbed under the guise of care. Vincent's hands shook as he listened to Eleanor describing his father as nothing more than a paycheck with a pulse, her voice filled with contempt for the very man she'd sworn to protect. She discussed Vincent's frequent absences with satisfaction, noting how grief had made him the perfect mark, too distracted to ask questions, too guilty to investigate irregularities, and too desperate for help to scrutinize the helper. Her strategy had been built on psychological manipulation as much as financial fraud, exploiting the vulnerability that tragedy creates in otherwise strong families. The evidence room in the basement also contained photographs that Catherine had somehow managed to take covertly, showing Theodore in various states of distress that contradicted Eleanor's reports of his improving condition. Bruises documented at different stages of healing told a story of ongoing physical abuse, while pictures of medication bottles revealed dangerous combinations that could explain his increasing lethargy and confusion. Catherine had been building a case against Eleanor even while fighting her own battle, using her remaining strength to protect the family she would have to leave behind. Her final gift to Vincent was the ammunition he needed to destroy the predator who had infiltrated their lives during their moment of greatest vulnerability. Detective Sarah Morrison had seen enough elder abuse cases to recognize the signs immediately when Vincent presented Catherine's evidence at the police station the following morning. The methodical documentation impressed her. Most families discovered abuse too late and with too little proof to build a solid case, but Catherine's investigative work provided a roadmap for prosecution that would be difficult for even the most skilled defense attorney to challenge. Morrison assigned 2 officers to maintain surveillance, while she obtained warrants for Eleanor's financial records and communications. Vincent returned home with a hidden recording device provided by the police, his instructions clear but terrifying. Continue normal interactions with Eleanor while gathering additional evidence of her crimes. The woman who had seemed so threatening just hours before now appeared almost pathetic as she prepared his father's lunch with exaggerated care, clearly attempting to re-establish her facade of devoted service. Her performance felt desperate now that Vincent knew what to look for, each gesture of false kindness highlighting the cruelty it was designed to conceal. Theodore's testimony, given in the safety of the local police station while Eleanor believed he was at a doctor's appointment, provided crucial details about the daily reality of his captivity. He described being forced to sign documents he wasn't allowed to read, being threatened with nursing home placement if he complained about his treatment, and being deliberately isolated from friends and neighbors who might question his condition. His account of psychological torture was methodical and devastating, delivered with the clarity of someone whose mind was much sharper than his captor had realized. The financial investigation revealed a network of fraud that extended beyond the Caldwell household to at least 6 other families in the surrounding counties. Eleanor had perfected a system of targeting recently widowed men with elderly parents, using employment agencies and grief counseling groups to identify potential victims. Her partner, revealed through phone records to be her own adult son, provided false references and helped establish the legitimate facade that allowed her to gain access to vulnerable families. Bank records showed that the stolen money had been funneled into offshore accounts and real estate investments, suggesting a level of sophistication that elevated Eleanor's crimes from opportunistic theft to organized elder abuse. The district attorney's office estimated that her operation had stolen over $2 million from families who had trusted her with their most precious responsibilities. Vincent felt sick, realizing that his family's tragedy had been nothing more than a business opportunity to a woman who specialized in monetizing grief and vulnerability. The evidence was overwhelming, but Eleanor still moved through their home as if she owned it, unaware that her criminal empire was about to collapse around her. The confrontation came at dawn, when Eleanor typically administered Theodore's morning medications, a routine that Vincent now understood was designed to keep his father docile and confused throughout the day. Detective Morrison and 2 uniformed officers positioned themselves strategically around the house, while Vincent activated the recording device hidden in his shirt pocket. Eleanor entered Theodore's room with her usual collection of pills and syringes. But this morning Theodore was alert and sitting upright in bed, his eyes clear and determined for the first time in months. Eleanor's mask began to slip the moment she realized that Theodore had refused his evening medication the night before, leaving him lucid enough to resist her morning routine. "You need to take these now," she insisted, her voice carrying an edge of desperation that she'd never allowed Vincent to hear before. "Your son is counting on me to keep you healthy, and these medications are essential for your condition." But Theodore shook his head firmly, his voice stronger than it had been in months as he told her he was done being poisoned into compliance. The transformation in Eleanor was immediate and terrifying. Her carefully maintained facade cracked completely as she grabbed Theodore's wrist with enough force to leave new bruises, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper as she told him exactly what would happen if he continued to defy her authority. She detailed threats that revealed months of psychological warfare, promising isolation that would make his current situation seem comfortable by comparison. Vincent felt his blood turn to ice as he listened to the woman he'd trusted reveal herself as the monster she'd always been. "Vincent, she's been hurting me every day since you've been gone," Theodore said clearly, his voice carrying through the house with enough volume to ensure the hidden recording devices captured every word. "She steals money from your accounts. She locks me away when people visit, and she gives me drugs that make me sick and confused." His testimony was methodical and devastating, delivered with the clarity of someone whose mind had been deliberately clouded, but was now sharp enough to bear witness against his tormentor. Eleanor's response was a complete abandonment of her caregiver persona, as she unleashed a torrent of abuse that revealed the depth of her contempt for the family she'd been systematically destroying. Her words were filled with racial slurs, class resentment, and detailed threats that demonstrated her complete lack of genuine care for the man she'd sworn to protect. She screamed about ungrateful rich families who deserved to be robbed, about old men who were better off dead, and about her right to take what she'd earned through years of servitude to people she despised. Detective Morrison had heard enough. The signal was given, and officers entered the house to place Eleanor under arrest while her criminal confession continued to pour out like poison from a broken container. Eleanor's arrest was swift and efficient, but her verbal assault continued even as the handcuffs clicked into place, revealing a depth of malice that shocked even seasoned law enforcement officers. She screamed accusations at Vincent, claiming he was the real criminal for abandoning his father and leaving him vulnerable to legitimate caregivers who deserved compensation for their suffering. Her lawyer arrived within hours, but the evidence was overwhelming. Catherine's documentation, Theodore's testimony, the financial records, and Eleanor's own recorded confessions created a case that even the most skilled defense attorney couldn't challenge effectively. The trial became a sensation in local media, but Vincent focused entirely on his father's recovery rather than the circus surrounding Eleanor's prosecution. Theodore's physical healing was relatively quick once the harmful medications were eliminated from his system, but the psychological damage required more careful attention from specialists who understood the complex trauma of systematic abuse by trusted caregivers. Vincent arranged for the best therapists in the state, determined to spare no expense in helping his father reclaim his dignity and peace of mind. Eleanor's network of accomplices began unraveling as investigators followed the money trail and contacted other victims who had been too traumatized or embarrassed to report their experiences. Her son was arrested for conspiracy and fraud, while the corrupt attorney faced disbarment and criminal charges for his role in facilitating guardianship fraud across multiple counties. The ripple effects of her prosecution led to policy changes in caregiver licensing and background checks that would protect future families from similar predators. During the sentencing hearing, Vincent chose to address the court on behalf of his family, his words carefully chosen to honor Catherine's memory while ensuring that Eleanor understood the true cost of her crimes. He spoke about trust betrayed, vulnerability exploited, and the particular cruelty of someone who monetizes grief and preys upon families at their weakest moments. His statement was not about revenge but about justice and the need to protect other families from experiencing the systematic torture that his father had endured. Eleanor received a sentence of 15 years in federal prison for elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy, with additional civil judgments that would ensure her stolen assets were returned to her victims' families. As she was led away in shackles, she turned one final time to glare at Vincent with the same cold hatred that had been hidden behind her mask of false compassion. But her power to hurt his family was broken forever, and Theodore could finally begin the process of healing from wounds that went far deeper than the physical bruises that had first revealed her true nature. 2 years later, the Caldwell estate hummed with life in ways that Vincent had forgotten were possible. Theodore tended his rose garden with the patience and skill that had made him successful in construction, his hands steady as he pruned away dead growth to make room for new blooms. The physical therapy had restored most of his strength, but more importantly, the therapeutic work had given him back his voice and his confidence in his own perceptions. He moved through the house like a man who belonged there, no longer jumping at unexpected sounds or watching doorways with the wariness of someone expecting attack. Vincent had restructured his business to eliminate unnecessary travel, discovering that success measured in time spent with family was far more valuable than any international deal he might miss. Their breakfast conversations had become the foundation of each day, ranging from discussions of current events to planning improvements for the garden that had become Theodore's sanctuary. The guest bedroom where Eleanor had imprisoned his father was now a bright studio, where Theodore painted landscapes that captured the beauty he'd rediscovered in the world around him. The legal settlement from Eleanor's prosecution had been donated to establish a foundation dedicated to protecting elderly individuals from predatory caregivers, with Vincent serving as chairman and Theodore as an advocate who shared his story to help other families recognize warning signs before tragedy struck. Their work together had given new purpose to their relationship, transforming them from father and son into partners, united by their commitment to preventing other families from experiencing the systematic abuse that had nearly destroyed them. Evenings found them on the back porch that overlooked Catherine's memorial garden, sharing stories and memories that had been too painful to discuss during the immediate aftermath of her departure. Vincent had learned to speak about his wife without the crushing weight of guilt that had made him flee into work, while Theodore shared memories of his daughter-in-law that painted pictures of her wisdom and strength that Vincent was only beginning to fully appreciate. Her presence seemed to surround them during these conversations, not as a source of pain but as a reminder of the love that had guided them through their darkest period. The house itself had been cleansed of Eleanor's presence through careful renovation and the addition of security systems that would never again allow a predator to operate undetected within their walls. But the real protection came from their renewed connection to each other and their commitment to never again allow grief or busy schedules to create the isolation that had made them vulnerable. Evil had been punished, goodness had been rewarded, and justice had been built through truth, courage, and the unconditional love that binds families together even in their darkest hours.